Talks between an Ethiopian government delegation and rival Tigray forces officially began on Tuesday in South Africa. These are the first formal peace talks since civil war erupted 2 years ago. The conflict has killed thousands, displaced millions, and left perhaps millions on the brink of famine. VOA's Paul Ndiho has more.
Negotiations between an Ethiopian delegation and Tigray representatives are underway in South Africa Tuesday and are expected to end on Sunday, according to a spokesperson for the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa. The talks came after the Ethiopian military and their allies, which include troops from neighboring Eritrea, captured several large towns in Tigray in the past week. Hassan Kineji, the director of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, says there must be a commitment to a long-term solution, and the process needs to be as inclusive as possible.
It is important in part because the mediators have managed to get both parties to a negotiating table. To the extent that they've been able to get to that agreement is important. And it's likely then that we may perhaps see a ceasefire in the coming days.
The situation appeared to put Ethiopian government in a stronger position than its Tigray rival going into the talks.
The process needs to be as inclusive as possible to prevent the specter of spoilers actually destroying the entire process. Because previous attempts, not just in Ethiopia, but of similar processes, one thing that they've always left out is they've not been as inclusive, and therefore that ended up actually invalidating whatever agreement that may have been arrived at.
However, it was under pressure from foreign powers, including the United States and European Union, to halt its offensive. White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre on Monday commended South Africa for hosting the first formal peace talks of the conflict.
We call on the government of Ethiopia and the Tigrayan authorities to engage seriously in the AU-led talks to achieve an immediate cessation of hostilities, unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to all Ethiopians in need.
The war is rooted in a power struggle between the federal government and Tigray authorities, who led the country's ruling coalition until Abiy Ahmed became prime minister. The Tigray People's Liberation Front dominated Ethiopia's ruling political alliance for decades before Abiy Ahmed took power in 2018 and sidelined the party. Fighting resumed in August, shattering a truce and halting humanitarian aid into Tigray, a region of 6 million people. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
For more on Ethiopia, I'm joined by Solomon Abate, VOA Horn of Africa Acting Chief. Solomon, welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you, Esther. Good to be here.
Update us on what's happening, especially in the region of Tigray, even as the peace talks commence in South Africa.
The guns have not been silenced yet until I have arrived here in the studio, but the hope is that they would agree on some kind of cessation of hostilities. And what pushes me to say this is, recently, a few minutes ago, I received a letter from the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mr. Musa Faki Mohammed. He said the chairman is for the statement issued by his office is the chairman is encouraged by the early demonstration of commitment to peace by the parties and to seek a lasting political solution to the conflict in the supreme interest of Ethiopia.
Now, as the international community continues, to ask for cessation of the war and the conflict in Ethiopia, that began, a year and a half ago now. What role are they playing now? What are they saying as the peace talks begin in South Africa?
Before the peace talks have begun, and even yesterday, the international community have been expressing support to this peace process. And also, they have been calling for immediate cessation of hostilities and serious engagement in these peace talks on of all parties in the peace talks. And also they are calling for unhindered humanitarian access and the withdrawal of Eritrean troops from northern Ethiopia. This has been said by the White House, the Karine Jean-Pierre yesterday, and by State Department spokesperson Ned Price, and also almost I can say the entire Senate, starting with Senator Bob Menendez, wrote a letter before the start of the talks to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, expressing their content with the fact that Ethiopia supports the peace process and called for all these points, including the cessation of hostilities. And the European Union is involved, and AU, United Nations, is also involved.
Solomon, thank you always for the updates from the Horn of Africa.
You are welcome.
Solomon Abate is the VOA Horn of Africa acting chief. For more perspective on the Ethiopia talks, joining me live via Skype from Nairobi is William Davison, a senior analyst for Ethiopia with the International Crisis Group. Mr. Davison, welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Davison, the first question is the peace talks are ongoing, as we just had a short discussion here with my colleague. What are your expectations? What is the outcome likely to be from what you know?
I think the hope from the mediators and many other actors inside and outside Ethiopia is for a cessation of hostilities agreement here. As described, there is still active, ongoing fighting inside Tigray. The federal military and their Eritrean allies have made significant advances in recent days, over the last week or so. The federal government has stated its intention to control all federal facilities inside Tigray. And we do expect there to be continued resistance from Tigray's regional government and its forces to that federal ambition and to the Eritrean presence. So because there is this ongoing active conflict, the mediators, the African Union and their partners really face a challenge to get the parties to agree to a truce. And of course, it is only the federal and Tigray representatives at these talks. So even if they do agree to a truce, there is still the outstanding question of the response of Eritrea's government and its armed forces.
And that brings me to the question of, even as the peace talks continue, who is going to be held accountable for the millions or thousands of people who have been killed during this conflict?
That is very much an outstanding question. Of course, we have seen all sorts of atrocities during this conflict. Serious allegations, some of them essentially confirmed, against Eritrean troops, Ethiopian troops, massacres, sexual violence, looting inside Tigray, an allegation of ethnic cleansing against Amhara elements in western Tigray, and then reports of atrocities by Tigray's forces when they advanced outside of Tigray last year. So far, we have seen very little in the way of accountability, only promises of such by the federal and Tigray governments, and really because the international actors, whether journalists, humanitarians or human rights investigators, they have essentially been blocked from any serious investigation of what has been going on during this war. So there's really not been enough evidence collected for any kind of international process, which of course those Ethiopian and Eritrean actors would resist anyway. So we know there has been mass suffering and atrocities, but we are a long way from accountability at the moment.
And very briefly, Davison, what's your interpretation of calling for peace talks while at the same time we've seen continued airstrikes and bombardment of areas in Tigray, including the capture of key cities in that region?
There is certainly signs here that the federal government particularly is taking a two-pronged approach. It is trying to achieve its objective of controlling all federal facilities inside Tigray militarily, whilst it is also engaging in the diplomatic process, the peace talks in South Africa. And that is what makes it so challenging to get to a cessation of hostilities, although that is, of course, incredibly necessary given the continued suffering we see inside Tigray and outside.
William, thanks. William Davison is a senior analyst for Ethiopia with the International Crisis Group.